Okay, welcome to Basagan Trip. I'm your host, Lalo Claudio. I teach Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. So for today, I'm going to interview someone who usually interviews me. No need to introduce her. She's our executive editor here at Rappler, and of course, co-founder and also CEO. And also, technically, somebody who's been convicted by the government. Maria Ressa, thank you for joining us, Maria.
Hi, Leloy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I didn't mean to call you a convict, but actually, I think calling someone a convict in this context is actually a compliment.
It's the alternate realities. I always talk about how it becomes real. How
Mm,
does something seeded on social media in
mm.
2016 become fact in 2020? I lived it. It's
Yeah,
real
yeah,
for me.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, this person doesn't look like a criminal, but she's technically a criminal. And in this world, journalists are criminals. So, I guess the first question I really want to ask is also for today's episode, I really just want to talk about disinformation. And I want to ask you how Pinoy should think about this information and what they can do about it, and how they should conceptualize it. But before that, Maria, I just wanted to ask, how are you? Have you been?
I'm good. I'm good. It's funny. It's the first question everyone asks me, and I think part of it is because despite all of the battles that we're facing, despite hashtag hold the line, right? This
Mhm.
is a really exciting time. It's
Yeah.
really creative destruction. I don't think we've lived through anything like this. I certainly haven't in my lifetime.
Mm.
And the fact that the pandemic happened once in a century, the fact that news groups business models are disintegrating.
Mm.
I don't know when the last time this happened, and the very platforms that are actually getting the advertising revenues are the ones that are being used as a
Yeah.
way to kill the facts, to
Mm.
kill the credibility of institutions. So
Mm.
yeah, sorry, I dive in,
Yeah.
right? I think
Yeah.
if you're a geek, this is an amazing time to be a
Yeah.
geek because it proves more than at any other time that information is power.
Right.
But what you said, right? Like, so how do we think about it? I think you have to
Yeah.
think about it like it's an experiment, an ongoing experiment, and we are all part of it, especially Filipinos, because 100% of Filipinos are on the internet or on Facebook. Facebook really is our internet. So
How does that compare to Twitter? Like, what are the percentages? Twitter or
much
YouTube?
lower on
Mm.
Twitter. The last time we checked it was maybe like a fraction, 40%,
Mm.
30% to 40% on Twitter,
Okay.
and still
Mm.
growing
Mm-hmm.
because the folks who were involved in the machine have shifted to Twitter as well.
Mm.
And I think our data has proven that there is no doubt that this is uh, asymmetrical warfare, that the big chunk that is involved in disinformation are
Mm.
state sponsored or state aligned,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and then you have little groups, and they would be one-offs, some of the politicians,
Mm.
some groups that are coming together to try to fight back. They
Mm.
use the same tactics,
Mm.
but it's very much, the Goliath is state sponsored, state aligned,
Mm.
and then you have these little groups that are more like gnats, to be
Mm.
honest. At least that's the way the mapping looks.
So how
um,
do you figure these things out? How do you figure out which part of it comes from the government, which parts of it come from these nats, and then how do you measure the impact?
so I think there are three ideas that I want to just make sure so you understand the framework of how we
Mm.
analyze it. The first is that we don't look at the content,
Okay.
and because the content is like changing clothes, it's like playing whack-a-mole, which is
Mm.
why when you're only talking content moderation, that changes so fast you're never going to get it. But what you look at, the same way you look for terrorists, and this is where I got it from, because the idea came from tracking down Al Qaeda operatives,
Mm. Mm.
tracking down Al Qaeda in Southeast Asia, which is
Mm.
something I've been doing for what,
Mm.
like 20, 25 years, I guess,
Yeah.
20 some odd years.
Mm.
My second book was called From
Mm.
Bin Laden to Facebook. The
Mm.
first one was Seeds of Terror, How Al Qaeda Shifted to Southeast Asia. So I just took what we were doing in the real world, which is the spread of a virulent ideology
Mm.
physically, amped up on social media. Okay, so three ideas. I think the first idea is don't think content, think networks. So we look at the networks of disinformation,
Mm.
and those networks are created and they keep doing that despite whatever content is there. So the way Rappler does it is we're fact checking partners of Facebook. Whenever we see a lie, we look
Mm.
at how the lie is spread.
Mm.
First concept. The second concept, I think, is to think about influence operations. And influence operations are identical to information operations. It is how influence operations is used by military. That's where it came from. In the Philippines in the late 80s, early 90s, we called it psyops. When I was
Mm.
a young reporter, I remember covering the Philippine military and psyops in areas
Yeah.
that were controlled, right?
And the
So
Russians call it active measures, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
right? So and the Russians are the ones to look at here because they were the most successful in 2014. They
Hmm.
literally created an alternate reality in the Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, right?
Yeah.
So 2014 was a banner year for a lot of things. But when you think about influence operations, think about it like this. Like it's a closed system. So our system that we look at is in the Philippines, this closed system. You throw in, you open a virus. I was calling it a virus before the pandemic, but it's a virus of lies. And
Mm.
epidemiology is the right way to think about it because when you throw that virus in, it infects real people, and those real people then change. So in that information ecosystem that's closed, you feed in a
Mm.
virus, a lie,
Mm.
and it changes the way people think and the way they act. Remember, and then this is the third part, right? So changing that, and it's been 4 years of these influence operations, not just in the Philippines, but globally.
Mm.
And with that, hand in hand with that, you see the deterioration, the crumbling of democracies all around the world. From 2017, it was counted at 28 countries, to 2019, Oxford University's Computational Propaganda Research Project put it at 70, at least 70 countries in 2019. And then this will lead to the last part, which is how does the narrative spread, right? Because in the end, what's the goal of these influence operations? It isn't just to make you click on one story or even just to make you believe President Duterte is wonderful. He's a god. That's
Best
not even
president
the
in the
goal.
universe,
Yeah,
according to
yeah,
NASA.
right. You've seen
Yeah.
all of this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not the goal. The goal, and this you go to Russian military doctrine to see the evolution of this. In Russian military doctrine, hand in hand, the goal of influence operations is to cave it in from the inside, which is to make you distrust everything.
Hmm.
Because if you don't trust anything or anyone, number one, you can't act. Number two, you can't have civic engagement. And then number three, the voice with the loudest megaphone, the person in power, the government in power gains greater power because they have formal authority. So all around the world, what we've seen is the birth of these digital authoritarians who have used this well. They come bottom up, exponential lies, and then they use the power that they have been given through elections, and they come top down to cave in democracy from within. It's
Hmm.
like using the levers of democracy to to turn it to, like in our case, a dictatorship. I mean, this is where we're headed, right?
Hmm.
You can see it. But I
Yeah, so
guess
speaking of the Philippines and speaking of this international setup, I'm curious how much of what's happening in the Philippines just mirrors what's happening, say, in the United States or in Russia or in Ukraine, and what part of it is unique to the Philippines? Because there's been some research, for example, Jonathan Ong's research, and he says that you have to nuance the kind of disinformation that's happening in the Philippines, and the nuance that's necessary is to talk about it in light of our own domestic PR industry, and it's important to look at the kind of behavior that emerges from our peer industry. So I wonder, like, when you conceptualize this information, how much of it is local and how much of it is international in terms of the sourcing, but how much of but also the kind of language we use to talk about this information, how much of that kind of international language do we deploy, and how much do we use our own categories or the specific nuances of Philippine politics to talk about the disinformation?
so. Nothing is unique about the Philippines.
Mhm.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing, except for the fact that we were probably a guinea pig for the real targets, which was America. And
Right.
let me phrase that, so Chris Wiley, who's the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Brittany Kaiser, who is an insider, she headed digital, digital business growth for Cambridge Analytica, both of them. So Chris Wiley said that we were the petri dish, that Cambridge Analytica and SCL tested tactics of mass manipulation in the Philippines and countries like ours. That would be, you can look at maybe Sri
Indonesia.
Lanka, Nigeria. They're all in Damian Collins's report
Mhm.
to the UK. There's a group that
How about Myanmar? Because it's
Myanmar is a whole
particularly
different scale.
virulent there as well, right? Because
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
they're killing
Myanmar is
people because of
genocide,
disinformation. Yeah.
proven genocide, right? But
Yeah.
again, like I when you only look at the advertising industry and how it has been co-opted as the foot soldiers, I think you're like looking at the letters and not the
Mhm.
thesis. And the reason I say that is because in every country there are foot soldiers, and in every country those who are in digital are the ones, and they tend to be both advertising people who understood this because clients come to them to ask how to create influence online. But
Mhm.
at the same time, they're also the young kids who found this first, right?
Mhm.
In fact, in the Philippines, you go back to 2015 with Aldab. It was actually a small group of 12 to 16-year-olds who paved the way for the advertisers, for the people in the advertising industry to even try to figure out how to work it.
Mhm.
So when you're talking about the foot soldiers, you miss the entire infrastructure.
Yeah.
And it is the same in every country, even though the ones who have done it. So when you're talking foot soldiers, who puts them to work? And
Mhm.
here we have some names in the Philippines, someone like Nick Gabunada, who was both CEO of Omnicom Media, a top advertising agency, but also was in charge of social media of President Duterte, then Mayor
Mhm.
Duterte's campaign.
Yeah.
That's fascinating because he is the only, as of like the beginning of this year, he was the only private person that's been named by Facebook, and the only private person whose networks were taken down in one chunk right
Mhm.
before the elections, the 2019
Mhm.
elections, right? So advertising is the kind of how, but if
Mhm.
you don't look at the why and only kind of say, oh, well, because everybody's doing it, that's not true. Not
Mhm.
everybody is doing it, you know. And I guess the last chunk of that is uh, the big picture, which is local is global and global is local.
Mhm. Mhm.
The tainting of our information ecosystem, the fact that we live in the upside down today, is because of decisions made in Silicon Valley,
Right.
and those decisions permeated were
Mhm.
attacked countries in the global south far more because our institutions are weak, we have endemic corruption, we have no regulation,
Yeah.
or if the regulation is in
Yeah.
place, they're co-opted by the power that wants to retain this.
And and my theory has always been that Facebook just doesn't care about our democracy the way they care about American democracy. So I mean, do you think this is true? Like, Mark Zuckerberg is an American. He cares about where his country is going. So if he ruins American democracy, he might care a bit more. I'm not sure he really cares, but he probably cares marginally more about American democracy than he does about Philippine democracy.
Maybe it's not even thinking about caring or not, right? So I actually met him in 2017, and I told
Mm.
him how powerful Facebook was here. It isn't even that he can care or not care, but think about what this guy is thinking about, because he is not very old. I mean, he's
Yeah.
young, you know, he is 30, what, like, he's not even mid 30s, or he's just at mid 30s. He's very smart, but he's also made his entire life, if you read Stephen Levy's book, is really about pushing back. He is a rebel,
Mm.
and being rebellious, dropping out of Harvard, right, has gotten him to places. Except now, here's the reason why he has to care about American democracy: because he can be held liable,
Right.
because the
Right.
rules are going to be put in place, because it is an American company. It has oversized power. He's as powerful as the president of the United States, if you think about it like that, right? I mean, which platform puts together, I think it's almost 2.8 billion accounts, cutting across
Mm.
all of the vertical silos of media? That
Yeah.
is tremendous power. But
Mm.
so, having said that, that's the reason why I joined the Real Facebook Oversight Board, Leloy,
Mm.
on October 1. This is Carol Cadwalader, who broke the Cambridge Analytica investigations.
Right. Mm.
Shoshana Zuboff, who's a Harvard professor emeritus, wrote this 750-page book called
Mm.
The Age of Surveillance
Mm.
Capitalism, where she basically looks at the economics of
Mm.
Facebook, of YouTube, of the social media platforms, and tells you that this extractive process that essentially insidiously manipulates us, sells our most vulnerable moment to a message, and they can sell it to a company or a country,
Mm.
right? And that then creates, it literally impacts how we behave. That should be outlawed. She compares it to the slave trade. That's how, I mean, I can unpack this
Yeah.
for you, because I this is the part I find fascinating, because we like to think in the Philippines that's that what's happening here is unique. It isn't. It is
Mm.
happening in every democracy around the world, and it is the only way. The first step, at least for me, of fighting back is changing the role of the new gatekeepers, right? Demanding accountability from them as well as we do from our government.
I'm going to ask about how effective Facebook has been, or whether or not the steps they've taken have been adequate. Of course, the answer is no, right? But I'll ask you that question later on. But for now, I just want to double back a little bit, because you were talking about Cambridge Analytica and all these networks. It's really skullduggery. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of people don't talk about that is because it's hard to prove a lot of these things, because these are nefarious actors. These are, as I said, skullduggery. So how do you study this, Maria?
So in 2016, we came out with this three-part propaganda war series.
Mm.
The first was weaponizing the internet. The second is how Facebook
Yeah.
algorithms impact democracy. The third is manufacturing consensus, how
Mm.
26 fake accounts impact 3 million others. I wrote two of the three parts of that series that we published, and I got clobbered online.
Mm.
Never felt anything like it before. And so, um, what we had to do was to figure out, your question was a survival question for me in 2016, because how do you fight back an unseen enemy, right?
Mm. Mm.
Number one,
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
unseen. Number
Okay.
two, digital is forever. you know
Mm.
um,
Mm.
and that's where, when I listen to the armed forces chief talk about, where he defends the soldiers who are handling hands off our children, and that makes me just realize they don't understand how digital creates a map of your behavior
Mm.
and can be traced. Digital forensics is far more accurate than
Mm.
investigative journalists have been able
Mm.
to do in the
Yeah.
real world, because you don't have to ask anyone. You just
Mm.
have to look at how they behave, and
Mm.
that data is online. So that was what we did. What we did in
So that's
2016.
step one. Look at behavior, how
Step
behavior
one,
mirrors other behavior.
pull the data. You have to
Okay.
first look at this, and the data is publicly available. It's in plain sight. Like
Okay.
terrorists hiding in plain sight, it's in
Mm.
plain sight. What we had to do was learn to create a methodology of how we put it together, and then pull down the relevant data, and then create network maps, right? So
Mm.
what we tried to do was to get a sense, a snapshot at every moment. Here's the database of the Philippine information ecosystem.
Mm.
And once we saw that, once we saw the tactics, once we saw the design of the platform, that was how and that's how I get confidence to fight back, right?
Mm.
How do you stand up to a president? How do you stand up to a government with its
Mm.
vast powers?
Right.
You, we're just a small little group, and I'm only one citizen in this. And the
Mm.
reason is because we see the data, and
Okay.
the data is damning.
Okay, and the other methodological question I wanted to ask is how do you measure the impact of this data? So, for example, like, Pulse Asia survey, Duterte, 91% popular. How do we know that? How do we ascertain that it was disinformation or that this information partially caused that result?
Yeah, we Rappler did an editorial on this
Mm.
because we had interviewed Ronnie Holmes,
Mm.
who and disclosure. I know Ronnie Holmes and Anna Tabunda very well because when I was head of ABS-CBN News, Pulse Asia was our partner. We worked very closely with them.
Mm.
I know their methodology. I know the way they handle statistical surveys, and I think in the old world they are amazing, but this is a new world. And
Mm.
he was asked, so what role does disinformation play? And Ronnie's response was,
I asked
uh,
him.
"You did."
Yeah,
Oh my God! Of
I
course, it
asked
was
him. Yeah,
your.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
tell me,
yeah.
Lord, tell me what did he say to your question?
Well, I think the viewers know that one of the things he said was that in the Philippines, it's still the traditional media that dominate the information ecosystem, and that a lot of people who use Facebook don't use it necessarily for news. So there are a lot of people on Facebook, but according to the surveys, most Filipinos still use it to share like whatever cat photos or to talk to their relatives. They don't use it to talk about politics.
So it was your interview. That's correct.
Yeah.
It was your interview that triggered that. And here's what's wrong with that answer. Rappler actually came out with an entire editorial afterwards. Point number one is that that's no longer true. That television is king. Because if you look at surveys that have been done of the Philippines and the actual behavior on digital, you'll see that brands, for example, it's almost 50-50 now. 50% look at television, 50% on social media. Number two, in terms of disinformation, when 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on social media,
Mhm.
did they actually ask, so how do you define news, right? If your sister told you what this is and they
Okay.
got it from disinformation, is that news or is it not
Mhm.
news?
Mhm.
Redefining. So I think the first is, let's put out that editorial, but let me pull it to a bigger, broader technological
Mhm.
shift, right? And
Mhm.
this tech shift happened in 2013, way earlier. I guess, sorry, let me just do a quick answer to that. I think that, for all of my respect with the statistical surveys and the groups that do this in the Philippines, you can even look at SWS, which actually in last year had already said that social media has matched and at times overtaken television. So
Mhm.
that's two statistical surveys fighting each other on that thing. But I would think that, they, like hotels, like taxis, are going to have to deal with the impact of technology. And I would go back in time to 2013, which is when Rappler had to deal with big data. And I guess here, maybe let's pull up this graph, and I pulled this out of a slideshow that I did when I was trying to explain what big data was. So this one is interesting to me because this is a 2013 slide, right? Where it's the difference between data on your Excel sheet versus big data.
Mm.
And really, this idea, because this is the foundation of every single innovation, whether it is Uber, Airbnb, Facebook, right? It's the data, it's the amount of data that we can now analyze simultaneously.
Mm.
And when you look at that, quantitative change leads to qualitative change. You change the essence by changing the amount. And the one that I want to look here is, for statistical surveys, it's this ability, the ability to analyze vast amounts of data. So instead of just talking to 1,200 people, that's the statistical survey, you can actually do n equals n equals all. So you no longer have to do random sampling, and it will give you a far more accurate big picture view so that you can look at the correlations.
So is that doable? Let's say like, you do n equals all, and then you run a survey of Duterte's popularity using an n equals all. How would we go about doing that?
So we
Like
actually did something.
re-engineering approval ratings. So are you proposing a new way of like investigate or researching approval ratings for politicians?
Yes, actually, this is, and actually, what I would suggest is our statistical survey companies look at several factors that they've refused to look at, because I understand why they want to stick to the methodology, because they want to compare it with the past. But
Right.
I'm saying that there's a break because technology has fundamentally changed the landscape, right? So what's happened here is in 2016, Rappler actually partnered with Globe, and we went in between. Instead of doing a statistical survey, we used phones to be able to do surveys that were in between. So instead of doing 1,200, we did 80,000. We could do tens of thousands in one chunk and ask more questions. And we did it every month leading up to the elections. I think starting December 2015, January, February, March, April, and then the May elections in
Mm.
2016, right? What was most interesting to me about it is we combined like kind of like the statistical sampling so that we make sure that we represent, that there's enough representation of urban versus rural, age groups, and
Class, region.
correct.
Mm.
Exactly. Exactly. And you'll know which ones, right? But what was interesting is the results we got in April of 2016 were identical results to the May elections. And I can share
Mm.
that with you.
Mm.
So it to me was like amazing. And if that was part of our business model, then we would have done it. But it wasn't. But I'm just saying that, I really, really appeal to these amazing people, because Pulse Asia and SWS have been there forever. But
Mm.
I think that this is the time when their industry has been overturned by technology. And then you add the Duterte administration, which to me, I have always said does, governs with the three C's: corrupt, coerce, co-opt, and then you add violence and fear. It's a very, very different landscape. And if you don't get the numbers right, you then become an enabler to influence operations, which is
Mm.
already happening on social media. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yeah. But I guess if you change the methodology, there's still a good chance that Duterte would be really, really popular, right?
Yes,
Largely because of
absolutely.
largely because of many things, because of disinformation, as you mentioned. But also, I don't think we should let. Do you think we should let the traditional media off the hook here? Because there is an interplay there. It's not as if news reporters can't be victims or can't be infected by digital disinformation, right? A lot of these folks are also on social media. So I guess I want you to discuss the kind of interplay, because we tend to think when we discuss traditional and social media, it's very tempting to discuss these two in isolation from each other. But really, there's a lot of overlap, isn't there? So how do we think about that overlap?
I'll talk about two examples for you,
Okay.
right? Yes, you're right that there is an interplay, but the Philippines is again different from other parts of the world and from the US, for example,
Mm.
in the sense that President Duterte attacked traditional media from the
Early.
beginning, right?
Yeah.
While he was still in Davao, he said, just because you're a journalist, don't think that you're exempted from assassination,
Mm.
right? And then he attacked the Inquirer first. He filed cases against the owners. Let me not make it personified. The administration filed cases against the owners. Then they attacked ABS-CBN. They were the second targets, the
Yeah.
largest broadcaster. President Duterte said he would not renew their franchise.
Yeah.
Fast forward a few years, the franchise isn't renewed. Then we were the third attack in
Yeah.
2017,
Mm.
right? So again, understand that media is under attack. And then the second part is, as media is under attack, it's the owners that tend to get attacked first, right? I'm in a very strange position in the sense that they attack our business at the same time they attacked me online.
Mm.
Um, but they did the same thing to say the owners of the Inquirer,
Mm.
and that kind of level of intimidation and fear and harassment has not
Mm.
been felt by owners in the same
Yeah.
level since 1970s
Yeah.
too. All right,
Mm.
and then I think the last part is separate the owners from the reporters. And this
Okay.
is why I have hope, because I do think the reporters want to do the story, but the pressure that is being put on the business prevents them. And I think, the reason why we can do this in Rappler is, how many more cases will the government file against us?
Mm.
I already have 8 criminal charges.
Yeah.
I just think that they forgot that our
Mm.
standards and ethics are really clear.
Mm.
I have spent most of my career outside the Philippines, and their tactics of intimidation are familiar, and we won't buckle. So, in that, but the thing is, we also don't own any other businesses,
Right. Mm.
so we have nothing else to protect but the
Yeah.
fact.
Yeah.
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 So to go back to this, understand right now that the core of every battle is the facts. Because if you don't have facts, and it is a fact from all of the studies, from the data, that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further on social media than really boring facts.
Mm.
And if you want a scientific journal, Science Magazine in 2018, Sinan Oral, who just wrote a book, Deb Roy, who was the former CTO of Twitter, they did a study that showed exactly that lies spread faster.
Mm.
Um, the second thing is, if lies spread faster, that means you make facts irrelevant. So that means, think about a democracy. If you don't have facts, you can't have truth, you can't have trust, you can't have democracy.
Mm.
Look at the US elections. How can you have elections if you don't have facts? So, sorry, this is a long winded answer
Mm.
to your question, but let me get to the answer to the question. Um, and the second part of that is to go to the United States, because there's a lot more. There are several books that have been written. Yochai Benkler from MIT actually traced how Russian disinformation on social media was picked up by Fox News
Yeah. Yeah.
and then
Yeah. That's
amplified.
where I was going, actually. Yeah.
Right, right. And then there's a lot more of this stuff that's happened. And again, the US media is just getting to the point where they're finally saying that a lot of the disinformation is coming from Fox, right?
Yeah.
And that is almost anathema to the way American media would speak, because they don't, like in the Philippines. So you can see the sensitivities of the media and all, but the reality still is that if you give people the ability to think, if you give them the facts, then they can make those decisions about traditional media outlets. The problem is that the insidious manipulation we are facing on social media is something humanity has never dealt with. That's
Mm.
why I move it away from media all the time,
Mm.
because traditional media has lost its power. We're no longer
Yeah.
gatekeepers. So
But
so
but in the US, I mean, insofar as they're still gatekeepers, some of them have decided that we're not going to cover the disinformation anymore. So if there's a story that emerges from social media and we think it's fake, we're going to stay silent about it. Or if there's dangerous discussion, for example, in these QAnon forums, we're not going to talk about them because we don't want people to end up Googling QAnon and then entering the rabbit hole. So there's some kind of responsibility that's emerging in traditional media in the US. Do you think traditional media in the Philippines has done something similar, or have people thought about this? I mean, in TV, in
I
print.
so Leloy, I think traditional media in the US will get to where we are. I think they're still far away from the evolution because they still haven't realized that they're still at the point where they think they have power. Sorry. I
Okay.
mean, in the sense that, they think they're still the gatekeepers. And maybe they are because penetration, like Americans, maybe 69%, up to 69% get their news from social media, right? So there's still a little bit of power, but that power is largely imagined and not
Mm.
doing the story. So we faced this in Rappler in 2016 when I was attacked and Rappler was attacked because we exposed the disinformation networks. And Glenda, our managing
Mm.
editor, actually said, Maria, maybe you shouldn't do these stories because you come under attack. I look back 4 years later, and I am so glad we did those stories because that helped alert the public. Now, let me go back to how you deal with terrorist threats.
Mm.
Power will always hold information back from people. But the idea always was, even when I was with CNN, I always used to say, you push to publicize the threat as much as you can because you have to warn people when they are in danger.
Mm.
And the problem right now is we are in incredible danger. We
Mm.
are being insidiously manipulated. And I guess, you won't really, let me show you what someone else did.
Mm.
Sinan Aral, and I go back to that because he just published a book September 15th. It's called The Hype Machine. And
Mm.
the good thing about him is that he's been studying this for 20 years. He's an engineer. He looked at neuroscience and then he looked at public policy. And when you put that together, so I'll try to do this quickly, but go
Mm.
to the middle. This is the technology trifecta. You notice it doesn't say media anywhere there, right? Because we are powerless. Number one. So, what's the technology trifecta? It starts with your smartphones, your cell phone that collects data from you, right? That is your gateway to the upside down. Sorry, you can tell it,
Mm.
but smartphones that collects data. On your smartphones lie your social networks, your digital, that's Facebook, YouTube, whatever other thing whatever other Shopee, Netflix, that is all data. It takes your data and it feeds it back to you. And that's where machine intelligence comes in. What do we do on a social media platform or on any digital platform? We put in our data. We put in what we want, what we think, and machine learning pulls it up to build a model of you. That model knows you better than you know yourself. And that model is then, along with others, pulled up by artificial intelligence. And that takes the most vulnerable the most vulnerable moment you have to a message, and it will sell you. It will sell that vulnerable moment. And that can be to an advertiser. That's kind of benign, but not really, because this is not advertising in the old sense.
Mm. Mm.
Or it could be to a country, which is
Yeah.
what's happening, right?
Mm.
State sponsored propaganda is
Mm.
different. This is behavior. This is a behavior modification system, and we are Pavlov's dogs. So when you're fed that, regardless of whether you take the message, accept it or not, the machine then pulls your response and learns so that it knows you better the next time it does that. This is
Mm.
continuous 100% of the time. And what that does is it creates these trends on the right. Look at that. What is personalized mass persuasion? This is why we can have alternative facts, alternative realities, because every feed is different. It's personalized. But if I pay enough, if a country pays enough or seeds disinformation enough, it can sway you to think that fact is fiction and fiction is fact. And I'll
Mm.
give you a really big example of how algorithms work in the
Mm.
Philippines,
But
right?
before that, companies don't have countries don't even have to pay a lot, right? That's why it's Russia is not some superpower anymore. It's actually quite poor, and yet it can manipulate the elections of the most powerful country in the world. So actually, it can be done on the cheap. So like if Russia can do that to the United States and Russia is poor, think of what a rich country like China could do to the Philippines. I mean,
Exactly.
that's why I'm so paranoid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And guess what, Leloy? The fact that on September 22, Facebook took down an influence operation from China. You know, it had
Mm,
targeted Taiwan first, then Indonesia, then the Philippines, and it was
mm,
most successful in the Philippines. This Chinese influence operations was seeding pro Duterte, pro Marcos, pro Sara Duterte for president. It was pro China, Chinese Navy, and it was attacking me, right?
mm.
Like just so again, that's an influence operation that is foreign. So
And that's chump change for the government of China, right?
exactly, exactly. And this is why it's so dangerous. But then the second trend that was there is hyper socialization. And this is critical because this leads to the virality of the
Mm,
messages that are seeded. Hyper socialization means that, look, in the real world, when we are face to face, we're not that way right now, but you know,
mm,
in the physical world, we have 6 degrees of separation. Um, on Facebook, on social media, that's 6 degrees because of hyper socialization, because the design of the platform has collapsed. It's actually less, far less. It's 3.75 degrees of separation,
mm,
right? And every single social media platform has a different, shorter, smaller level. And what that means is that virality, things go viral faster online than
mm,
in the real world because it's no
mm,
longer 6 degrees of separation. And then, you know, I guess this, if you can come back to me on this, let's drop the slide for a second. I want to show you how the feedback loop um, works in the Philippines with the
mm,
pro Duterte and anti Duterte. In 2016, we were all in the center in terms of facts. We
mm,
agreed on shared facts, right? Regardless of which side and we weren't as polarized as we are now, but this is how we got there. After the election of President Duterte, the social media platforms, and this is Facebook, YouTube, the way they made one technical decision, their recommendation engine for growth uses friends of friends, right?
mm,
Because they've A/B tested this. They know this is the best. But this is what it does to society. So here we are. If you're pro Duterte and you grow your network with friends of friends, you move further right. If you're anti Duterte and you grow your network with friends of friends, you move further left. Facebook is growing on both these points, right? So, regardless of whether you're pro or anti Facebook benefits or whatever social media
mm,
platforms, and as they grow over time, you splinter the public sphere even further apart.
mm, mm,
That means the echo chambers are there. That means you can have the alternative facts. So, to go back to the statistical surveys, there's absolutely no way that those surveys happened without being influenced by disinformation. And I know this firsthand. Let me end with this one, right? Seeding of social of the message in 2016. In Facebook, the message of journalist equals criminal was seeded in 2016
mm,
about me. And in 2016, I laughed because I thought, oh, by next year, I'll have been a journalist for 35 years. And, you know, I thought
right.
I have a long track record. I'm really old. It's very hard to like reinvent me right now.
Mm,
Uh, Boy, I was so wrong because the exponential attacks online made people think, well, maybe if there's smoke, there's fire. And then in 2017, President Duterte came top down in his State of the Nation address. He said the same thing, journalist equals criminal. In 2018, the government filed 11 cases against me and
mm,
Rappler. in 2019, they arrested me. In a 5-week period, I was arrested twice at the beginning
Mm.
in February.
Yeah.
Valentine's Day, I was finally released on bail, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I was in court cases, and then this is the weaponization of the law. So you're attacked bottom up, top down. And what
Mm.
happened in 2020? You pointed this out at the beginning. I was convicted of cyber libel, a crime that didn't exist when the story we published 8 years ago
Yeah.
happened. And it's for a story I didn't write, edit, or supervise at a
Mm.
time when the law didn't exist. I mean, come on. But as you pointed out, journalist equals criminal. So I
Mm.
laughed in 2016, and here we are in 2020. Look
Mm.
at the United States. Black
Mm.
Lives Matter, targeted on both sides. The Mueller report said this, targeted on both sides by Russian disinformation.
Right.
And the
Right.
end goal is not just to pound people to silence targets, but to tear society apart.
Yeah. Yeah, and it happened so quickly. Like Black Lives Matter, after the death of George Floyd, most Americans were for Black Lives Matter. And then Trump immediately says that, he's against it and that therefore blue lives matter. So it bifurcates immediately, and almost overnight, the people who support Black Lives Matter are the Democrats, and the people who are against it are the Republicans, when there was a plurality of support initially. So, I mean, that just goes to show the speed you were talking about earlier on.
But also beyond that, look at the United States, the same lessons that we've learned from the Philippines, which is bottom up and top down.
Mm.
President Trump, American journalists haven't, I mean, they've just started saying this now or
Mm.
in recent months, right, leading up to the 2020 elections. But President Trump's messages mirror the Russian disinformation. They
Right.
have for a while. So this is something to really look at, bottom up, top down, and the impact. And this is the part that we
Bottom
have
up, top down, global.
global.
Mm.
Leloy, as a sociologist, right? The sociologists still haven't looked at the impact of technology on emergent behavior, right? And this is also where I feel like the statistical surveys have to take that into account. Emergent behavior, when communities are at scale, when you have mass hate, pounding, Lenny Robredo, one of the
Mm.
first targets of attacks in the Philippines. Laila de Lima,
Oh, yeah.
the messages seeded about her are atrocious. And, I started actually sharing some of the messages that I get. And a German friend actually said, "Oh my God, Maria, that's exactly what the Germans did to the Jews," because it gets to a point where you push it's not about tearing down credibility anymore. It's about dehumanizing the
Right.
target.
Mm.
So violence is the next thing, right? So this is extremely dangerous. But the problem that I see, look at Lenny Robredo, right? If you don't take into account these factors that I pointed out, from fear to technology, um, you'll start to think that it's just politics that will tell you why she's at 50% and President Duterte is at 91%. This is not correct, and so that's why I do I go back. I feel like I appeal a lot to a lot of people recently, but I know these people. I know they're very good at what they do, but we can also be very stubborn, and maybe that's part of what we struggle with all the time, because we had all thought the world was one way. And I think what this time period I hope will show is that the old world is destroyed. We're standing on the rubble of the old world, and we are actively creating the new world right now.
Mm.
And, we need to be really aware of the impact of
Mm.
technology, especially because so many of us were forced online,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Well, because of the pandemic. But speaking of people to appeal to, I think the people you really need to appeal to and the people you've been appealing to are the social media companies. So can you talk a little bit about what they've done, what more they could do, what they should be doing?
Sure. Can we put up the slide again? I think there are four levers, and I've actually used it. If you think about Rappler itself, right? Our Venn diagram is journalism, technology, community, And
Mm.
look at the four levers here on the left side, right? So, sorry. So on trends, the last part is tyranny of trends, right? And that's the kind of manufactured consensus. If you're not with us, you're against us. That's the kind of thinking there. That's where the nastiness of human nature is enabled. This is really wrong. And, I believe that the design of social media truly has to be changed because you can destroy with this, but you cannot create. Um, and
Yeah.
here are the levers for how we are going to move forward. And Sinan Oral again, because he spent a lot of time thinking about this. He actually helped my own thinking, which is money. Go to the business model. This is Shoshana Zuboff, where she just basically says, outlaw the selling of our behavioral patterns, right?
Mhm.
Outlaw that insidious manipulation.
Oh, we're
Code.
gonna need Elizabeth Warren for that.
Well, there's that also, and that's
Mm.
part of the reason it becomes even more, radical, because now Facebook has skin in the game, or
Yeah.
right. So the second is code. Chris Wiley in his book recommends, why not have like for doctors where they're legally liable, coders when they build something. There's a code. What is the
Kind of
code?
Hippocratic oath for coders.
Correct. Correct.
Interesting.
Brittany Kaiser in her book says something similar. Roger McNamee in his book Zucked actually talks about, well, he goes into laws, but he talks about how the code is also weaponized. Norms. Norms are our culture, our standards. Filipinos like to think that we're like the only ones affected by this. We're not. And our norms have drastically changed. So we have
Mm.
to look at how do we change that, right? Like, what about hatred? Do we
Mm.
really hate more than we love? I hate to use the word love either, but you know what I
Mhm.
mean, Leloy? Is it good versus what happens to the goodness of human nature? Because that actually has empowered so much of what this country has done. And then the last one, the fourth lever, is laws. And I'm working very hard on all four of these. On the laws part, Roger McNamee in Zuck says this is the time for um, Americans to legislate antitrust laws. He's a very
Yes.
big on that, right? I'm not for breaking up Facebook because we're a Facebook partner. We're frenemies, right?
Mm.
But I do think that I appeal to their enlightened self-interest, and some regulation is absolutely necessary now because it's been the wild, wild west for too long, and we bear the brunt of it. In fact, I say I bear the brunt of this because, I mean,
Yeah.
I could go to jail because of what
Yeah.
they failed to do, right?
Yeah. So what are they doing? So what has Facebook done?
Okay. Well, look, in the Philippines, not enough.
Mm.
There have been four takedowns since 2018, and these takedowns all are connected to the propaganda machine of the administration.
Mhm.
The biggest takedown, Twin Mark Media, which was this is the kind of site that Mocha Uson shared the most. This happened last year. This takedown implicated Nick Gabonada. It implicated, maybe for the record, we exposed that more than a year before the
The
takedown,
takedown. Yeah.
right? And then this most recent takedown is instructive to us because their influence operations and finally Facebook is becoming far more transparent. They pointed out that the Philippine influence operations was linked to the police and the military. That's
Right. Mm.
dangerous. And
Mm.
for the armed forces chief to defend it is even more dangerous. And then, of course, the Chinese influence operations, which, by the way, they pointed out, was using AI generated photos to
Oh dear
create
Lord.
fake accounts
Mm.
and was also creating fake accounts for the US elections, right? China, Philippines as a
Mm.
little testing ground, US. So,
Mm.
have they done enough? No, absolutely not. Which is the reason why I joined the Real Facebook Oversight
Mm.
Board. And we had our first press conference October 1, and within 12 hours, we made three demands. And the first one was to take down all political ads the post that would delegitimize elections in the US. It's what you said. They have to care about US elections. And frankly, the rest of the world is going to feel the impact of whatever
Right.
the results are. So the three demands we had are connected to the US elections. They've already done two of the three, I
Mm.
think, something like that, right? Um, and look, I have no no illusion. I'm there because I'm a cautionary tale. I seem to be that way for a while. We're an
Mm.
example, and we're the global south. We're outside the United States, but we feel the same thing. So
Yeah.
what can they do? They're trying. Like, they just took down QAnon. Why didn't they do that before? And if they took
Ang
down,
tagal na
right?
niyan. Oh my God, And they were nuts from the beginning. And they're probably coming out and QAnon is probably based in the Philippines, right?
You
That's
saw
one
this?
report.
You did?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly, right?
yeah.
Like the
There's a reply
founder,
all episode talking about QAnon probably being based in the Philippines.
Leloy, the other thing that our research has shown us is that, when you go back even to Hotmail spam,
Mm,
there's always been an industry in the Philippines for all of that. And
mm.
as the spam industry was controlled, and remember, like, it was a man and machine solution, they just shifted to the next thing, which was social media. I don't know if you remember something called Mega Upload.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember that.
So the
Uh,
founder was in the Philippines, married a
oh,
Filipina,
okay. Oh,
right?
okay.
Kim Mega Upload, Kim
I
Mega
didn't know
Upload was a
that.
German guy who fled to New Zealand. The kind of fake, it's not just fake, but internet fraud is an
Mm,
industry in the Philippines. So
mm.
it isn't a surprise that we're a testing ground. And then something I knew when I was still with ABS and when I was with CNN is that when the digital world began emerging, because we speak English,
Mm.
Yahoo, for example, would test all of its digital products first here. Because
Right.
we're first for a lot of things. The SMS capital of the world. We're first. And so that's why we're a testing ground. And that's why it's important. And I think the rest of the world is now looking at what we have gone through and to get a sense of where they're going to. But look, this is a debate that's happening right now. And in fact, uh, uh, there's a film about Rappler, about us, that PBS Frontline is
Yeah.
going to be showing in January, right? Ramona Diaz did this film. And it's a debate because I always tell Rainey Aronson, who's the executive producer, we actually had a conversation about this. How do you think about journalism at a time when facts are at risk, when
Mm.
facts don't exist? And our position is that when it's a battle for facts, journalism is activism. But in the States, they're still able to say that we want to be in the center. How can and it will evolve if Facebook doesn't do more. But
Yeah.
how can you have a center when it's already been ripped apart?
Yeah. You
I
can't say
sound this.
how the historian. He's not my favorite historian, but my favorite quote from the historian Howard Zinn: "You can't be neutral on a moving train," and it makes sense. It's
I
just
love
it's
that.
just physics.
That's correct.
Mm.
Thank you. And I think the other, well, yeah. So that's kind of those are the main things that we can't. I think what happened. I remember talking to Jonathan about this at some point because I felt like at one point the government really made it a point to scare people, and
Mm.
the people who were working in the advertising industry, I think it's great to get their voice, but they're the foot soldiers.
Mhm.
I think you have to hold the masterminds to account.
So how do we do that?
You're going to help us, of course. How do we
Okay.
do it? I have a solution.
Okay.
Well, it's not a one size fits
If
all.
only we could snap our fingers, right? If only we had the infinity gauntlet.
So what this is the way we're working in Rappler, and I just wrote this last week, which is, again, we look at these three things: technology, journalism, and civic engagement. And
Mm.
I will look at it globally, right? So technology is, we appeal to the self-interest, enlightened self-interest of social media platforms. They're being forced to do far more in this short period of time, but it is too late, right? So
Mm.
number one, we need regulations. This is part of the reason I'm part of an infodemics working group that will come out with 4 papers on structural policy recommendations. It's part of the multilateral alliance. So more than 50 countries are already part of this. So that will come out in November. There's also kind of initiative of the real Facebook oversight board. The second is we have to help journalists survive the next few years. And the
Yes.
pandemic,
Yeah.
really killing advertising, the social media platforms kind of killing advertising for news. This means that the business of journalism, of news, is, unless you're the New York Times or the Washington Post,
Yeah.
it's the smaller groups are going to have a hard time to survive, and that's part of the reason I joined. I'm on the advisory group of this board. It's trying to raise $1 billion a year to help independent media, and this is the guy who's really been upfront is a guy named James Dean. He's with BBC Media Action, kind of like our Move PH. And
Mm-hmm.
Luminate is behind this, IPFMA. The third is civil society, right?
Mm.
Civic engagement. Uh, Guys, every generation gets the democracy it deserves. And our old ideas that, we can take democracy for granted, throw that out the door, throw it out the window, because civil society is critical here. We need to create in the real world a network of networks
Mm.
to protect democracy, to protect the facts. This is why I like the real Facebook oversight board, because there are fewer journalists that join. There, I think, two of us. The rest are academics, civil rights leaders like NAACP, the Color of Change. They are the Anti-Defamation League, the Derek from NAACP said it's, and I'm learning a ton from them because journalists don't think like activists, but I'm forced to, right? And this is a debate inside my own head. So civil society, how do we make every person in a democracy think about what you're willing to sacrifice for the truth? Because that's really a question we have to ask. So it's a multi-pronged approach, but that's where I split my time, Leloy, because and we miss you in the Philippines, by the way.
I miss I should have been home. I'm just stuck. I should have spent the summer in the Philippines. Well, um, I'd like to take a deep breath, Maria, because that was a lot to take in. And every time I talk to you, I do need to take a deep breath. It's not just because what you say is scary, and not just because what you say is a warning for all of us, but because what they do to you is scary. So it forces me to take a deep breath as well. Um, and I'd like to thank you for that. I'd like to thank you for your candor. I'd like to thank you for your bravery. I've always admired you for that. And I have to admit, I can't watch 1,000 cuts because it hurts too much to watch that stuff. And I need to steel myself. I also needed to steel myself for this interview because a lot of this stuff I knew was going to be depressing. But I think I'll go out on this. It's the fact that we need to allow ourselves to be depressed. We need to allow ourselves to face these hard truths, because otherwise we're just going to deceive ourselves. And if we deceive ourselves, we're not going to be able to move forward. So we have to have the difficult conversations. We have to we have to face the difficult emotions. And that's the only way we get through whatever this is. And I have no idea what this is, because this is a cluster F of things that are happening to us right now. Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much for helping us navigate this cluster F of things that we're going through.
Lelo, we had to fast forward through the fear and the uncertainty, and because it's not just about Rappler. It was really like it's personal, right? But I
Mm.
think this is where the excitement can come in, and this is why I like talking to you and why I love following your work. This is the time to build. right? Your generation, my generation did a crappy job, although Mark Zuckerberg is your generation. So it's not
Yeah,
difficult.
yeah.
But,
I think
you
he's
know,
exactly my age.
we'll see. So,
Yeah.
so I think this is the time when you think through the way you think the world should be. Because the
Mm,
good part of having a destroyed world is you're going to have to rebuild. And that's part of
mm.
what keeps me excited. Uh, and I think that's the frame, that's the mindset we should be in. Can we please throw out this crappy old world and do better? Right? I
Mm.
hope your generation will do better. And so far, from what I see in Rappler, our younger generation, they are idealistic, they are passionate. Um, you got to build a better world than the one we're leaving behind.
So it's okay to not be okay, but at one point you do have to start moving forward and taking the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to absorb it. I always say embrace your fear, right?
Mm.
Absorb whatever that is, realize it is the worst thing that we can think of. And then you say, so what do I do? You gotta act. Because if
Mm.
you don't act, think about it like this. We have never lived through a moment like this. It's a once in a century moment with the pandemic, with everything, with the information ecosystem upside down, with the pace of how we are being manipulated. Absorb it and then say, all right, so what am I going to do about it? Then, if all of us do something about it, that is the essence of democracy.
And with that, maraming salamat, Maria Ressa. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Leloy.
And thank you everyone for tuning in to Basagan ng Trip. Maraming salamat.